all by myself. Don't wanna be all by myself. I'm not going crazy. You're going crazy. New City Catechism, question 4. Fourth question of the New City Catechism reads, how and why did God create us? And the answer, God created us, male and female, in His own image, to know Him, love Him, live with Him, and glorify Him. It is right that we, who were created by God, should live to His glory. A couple of preliminary thoughts before we jump into the idea of the image of God and how we can think about that in terms of application. First, I am really going to focus on the image side of this answer. So you saw in that question and answer exchange there that there's, yes, an image, but there's also a purpose for the image, the glory of God. That purpose is really dealt with in question number 6. So I'm going to leave that for then, and I'm going to focus on the theology of the image right now. So that's first. Secondly, there needs to be a clarification. The Old Testament and the New Testament tend to talk about the image of God in a little bit of different ways. What this question is asking about is really how the Old Testament speaks about the image of God. So that's what I'm going to be trying to address, knowing that there's a little bit of a difference in some of the contextual things that go with image language. And then third and finally, there's a hermeneutical principle that we need to understand and apply when we start talking about the image of God. And hermeneutics is just a big fancy word for how you interpret the Bible. And the principle is pretty straightforward. Basically says, when the Bible speaks clearly, we speak clearly. And when the Bible doesn't speak clearly, don't try to pretend that it does. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So if the question is how and why did God create us, and He created us in His own image to know Him, love Him, live with Him, and glorify Him, that kind of begs the question, what is given to humanity in God's image? And theologians have pondered about that for thousands of years. They've had lots of different suggestions as to what is given to humanity when God created humanity in His image. I jotted down 7 things. For those of you who are in my applied theology class the last quarter, sorry, this is all going to sound very familiar. We covered the image of God in there. So you've probably heard this before. You get a little refresher. 7 things that generally come out when people start talking about the image of God and what that means. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are pretty regularly things that people start to suggest. First, God's given image gives humanity dominion, the right to have sovereignty over the creation. And you see this right in the following verse after the image language. Genesis 1:26 and 27 talks about the image. And then Genesis 1:28 says this. Get through the preliminary things in my Bible. Here we go. Genesis 1:28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over every other living thing that moves on the earth. So there's a suggestion that the part of the image of God is having dominion. Another one is creativity. The backdrop of Genesis chapter 1 is God the Creator. So when He talks about creating humanity in His image, that has to come with it some idea of creativity. Third, intelligence. There's an intellectual difference between humanity and the rest of creation. Fourth, relationship. You heard me talk about this one last time as we looked at questions of the Trinity and the inner workings of the Trinity being relational, and theologians speaking very frequently about that relationship being imparted into humanity in God's given image. 5th, morality. 6th, responsibility. And 7, even physicality. So those are a few things that theologians have suggested are given to humanity in the image of God. How do they come to those things? Well, the text isn't incredibly clear. Even though 128, you see that verse about dominion, and you see the backdrop of creation, the text doesn't come right out and say, God created man and woman in his own image, and this is what that means. It's a little bit non-specific. What people have typically done is that they've looked at characteristics of God, and then characteristics of humans, and then characteristics of animals. And they've tried to find what are things that God and humanity share that the rest of creation does not. I hope that makes sense. That question of the uniqueness of humanity in comparative terms to the rest of creation. Those are good logical reasons, but we want to go back to our hermeneutical principle on this. The text doesn't clearly say what is exactly given in the image. And while I think there's truth to those, I can't definitively say this is the biblical view of the image of God, because the biblical view is not incredibly specific, and so I don't want to be incredibly specific. However, just because the Bible doesn't tell us specifically what the image is, that doesn't mean it doesn't speak meaningfully about it. So there are a few things we can conclude about the image of God. First, it's given to all people. You see this in 126. He created them male and female. It's a donation of totality. Everybody is under that umbrella. God created all people in his image. Second, that image is not lost after the fall. If you flip over to Genesis 9 and verse 6, this is after the fall, after the flood. There has clearly been sin as a part of this world that has entered in, and yet God still speaks about humanity with a very clear language of his own image. Starting in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 9. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Now there's a debate as to, is the image altered or skewed after the fall? And that's a nuance that's worth pondering. But we can definitively say it's not lost entirely. After the fall here in Genesis chapter 9, we still see injunctions on murder because of the image of God, which brings us to the third thing we can definitively say about the image, is that it bestows dignity. Every person is made with value because they are made to reflect God. The reason that killing a person is outlawed and is different than killing an animal is because of the image bearers. Because humanity has been given a likeness of God that the rest of the created order does not have. So these things must be understood. The image is given to all people. It was not lost after the fall, and the image bestows dignity. We can say those things very clearly and definitively from the biblical witness. If that's the case, how then should we look to apply the image of God? I have 3 suggestions for you. This isn't a comprehensive list, but just 3 things to draw our attention to in a way of thinking about how we can apply the truth of God's image. First, you should view yourself as someone with great worth. It's a tragic reality that many people have been lied to about their worth in this world. They've been told over and over again by people close to them that they won't amount to anything and that they're not valuable. But God says differently. One of my favorite analogies is an economic one. If you remember in junior achievement, they came to your 5th grade class and they taught you how things were priced. And they told you there were 2 things you had to consider. Supply and demand. And then you grow up and you realize they're kind of lying to you, and it really doesn't matter about supply. All that matters is what someone is willing to pay. I could have the last cup of broccoli on the face of the planet and nobody would give me 5 cents for it because it's a cup of broccoli. The question then rises to the surface. What was God willing to pay for you? And that answer comes back to us, an infinite price. The Almighty God paid for you with His own life. So when you look at yourself in the mirror, even if everybody in the whole world tells you there is no value in you, God says definitively that is wrong. He speaks the truth to your value. Second point of application, you are accountable to God. Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, the religious leaders are trying to trap Jesus. A quick story, starting in verse 13. And they sent to him is Christ, some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you're true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" You can just hear the smug tone and 2,000 years later, can't you? Picking back up, verse 15. But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." And they brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." They marveled at it. If you've ever wondered if Jesus was cool, that is a definitive answer. Yeah, he was. That's a drop the mic moment. They don't even know what to say. Ravi Zacharias points out that in this story, they bring him the coin, right? And he looks at him, he says, "Whose image is this?" "Well, that's Caesar." And Jesus responds to them, "Pay to Caesar what's Caesar's, pay to God what's God's." But there should have been a follow-up question. Well, what's God's? To which Christ would respond, "Whose image is on you?" Friends, you're accountable to God. You are made in His likeness. You are accountable, responsible to Him. Finally, you should view others as people with great worth. If it's true that the image of God bestows dignity, and it's true that it's given to all people, then it's even the people you don't like. Those frustrating relatives of yours, that coworker that you're so thrilled you don't have to see right now. Even those people, those are the image bearers. James chapter 3 puts this in such painful terms for us flawed Christians. Starting in chapter 3, verse 9, James is speaking about the shortcomings of how people speak, the way they use their language. And with it, he says in verse 9, we bless our Lord and our Father. That's good. Say good things about God. And with it, we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. If you are a follower of Christ, you aren't just made in His image, but you are accountable to Him. You are beholden to Him. And one of the things that you have to consider in obeying Christ is caring for those who bear His image. I pulled a lengthy quote from a pastor named Alex Montoya. He wrote a book on preaching. And even though this is specifically about preaching, it's really applicable to just viewing people in the image of God. So I'm going to read it at length. There have been many times in my ministry when an icy chill has come over my heart. when my soul no longer weeps, and when my sermons no longer connect, when the act of preaching becomes drudgery, I know that I then have lost compassion for people. That is when I retreat to a small taco stand in the barrio of East Los Angeles, to a place where real people live. I order a cup of coffee, and I sit with my back against the wall. Then I watch, I observe, I read, and I listen intently for the heart cry. A group of gangbangers come in for a snack. 1 in 4 will die before the age of 18. 2 of the others will end up in prison. All are doomed to a hard life. A young mother comes in with her brood of youngsters. It's obvious that they are poor. They share drinks. They live in poverty. Some will never see a forest or snow. An old drunk staggers in, begging for a meal. He's quickly thrown out. That was somebody's baby boy. A mother at one time cradled that man and nursed him. The poor specimen of humanity has children. His wife is somewhere out there. They've long since disowned him, but they've not forgotten him. He's still somebody's dad. For all I know, he could have been my own. I look, I listen, until I hear their cries, until their souls cry out to me, "Please help, I'm perishing." Until the tears pour forth from my melted heart, I'm in love with humanity once again. Now I'm fit to ascend the pulpit, to weep with those who weep, to laugh with those who laugh, and to bring a living word, Christ, to a needy people. Now I can preach with passion, for I have compassion. We look at these points about the image of God, we have to conclude that people have great value. The scientific materialist worldview has nothing to offer here. More often than not, they try to disagree with it. They try to put that thought out of their head. But one of the more honest people in that worldview is a guy named Peter Singer. He's a philosopher. He worked at Princeton for a while. And he suggests that we should dispose of the idea of the sanctity of life, that we should think about value and tie it to capacity. Now, to make sure Singer's understood, he's, in his own words, trying to say that that doesn't mean we lower the value of humans, but we raise the value of animals. But if you've read the pages of history at any time, you can see when somebody starts to try and pull away the sanctity of life from any group or individual, it's going to be ugly very quickly. We as Christ followers, as image bearers, have a responsibility to see other people as image bearers as well, as people with great dignity and value and worth. Go and do so, church. Go love those around you, because they are tiny reflections of your Creator. How and why did God create us? God created us male and female in His own image to know Him, love Him, live with Him, and glorify Him. And it is right that we who were created by God should live to His glory.